Welcome to everyone who is both online and here in person. We are extremely excited by the response and interest in this discussion series that we're launching today. My name is Chris Kaliba. I'm the Steen Distinguished Professor here at the School of Public Affairs and Administration at the University of Kansas. Today is the first installment of a discussion series on the future of democratic governance that we'll be offering. And while it's heartening to see our field grappling with some of the big questions of our time, as evidenced in recent webinars from APAM and ASPA and NAPA, those of you in the PA field will know those acronyms, we need more forums through which to consider, process, and respond to the challenging dynamics of our time. The series will continue on March 29th at 10:30 a.m. Central Time with eminent scholar of elections administration Charles Stewart from MIT, who will present the Ethan Allen Lecture that will be focusing on threats to election integrity. So please be sure to join us. More information on that will be posted online, and those of you who have signed up for this webinar will receive details on Professor Stewart's talk. Future talks will be planned over the months and years to come, and we invite colleagues tuning in to suggest topics and speakers. We also look forward to collaborating with other schools of public policy, our professional associations, centers, and institutes on activities to foster dialogue around critical questions of democratic governance. We are staging this talk from the indigenous lands of several Native nations, which is currently the home of the Iowa tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, the Kickapoo tribe in Kansas, the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation, and the Sac and Fox nations of Missouri in Kansas and Nebraska. We also want to recognize recent tragedies, both here locally in the Kansas City region, as well as internationally, and we pause for a minute of reflection on the suffering and untold suffering of people around the world and here locally. Thank you for that. And I want to thank our team here at the KU School of Public Affairs and Administration and the KU Institute for Policy and Social Research for their support of this talk and this series. Following Al's talk, we will have time for questions and answers from the audience live here. There'll be a mic that will be circulated as well as online. Those of you online, there's a Q&A function of your online portal. Please type in your questions there. We'll be monitoring those and make sure we'll get to your questions going forward. We also are recording this, and we'll be posting this online, and we'll be letting people know about where to find it once it's up and running and edited. So, any of us who are committed to public service and democratic values are troubled by the current political conditions and fragile state of liberal democracies around the globe and in the United States. A polarized electorate and even more polarizing populist leaders espousing decidedly illiberalist values with plans to reform, dismantle, or sabotage the administrative state is a situation worth monitoring and mobilizing for. These are not the normal times when the field of public administration, scholars and practitioners alike, can ride the wave of political turnover occurring between different political parties. We face many existential threats, and I hope that one day I can be accused of hyperbole on any one of them. These threats not only include the illiberalism of the day, but also the environmental and technological disruptions from climate change and artificial intelligence. I was hoping to launch the series with a leading voice of our field to help us deconstruct current times and engage in some critical thoughts and self-reflection about the state of public administration as a scholarly field, as a noble profession, and most importantly, as a set of practitioners charged with the responsibilities, accountabilities, and ethics as agents of democratic governance. And I can think of no scholar of the current age who has done more thinking, writing, self-reflection on these matters than Al Roberts. Alasdair Roberts is a professor of public policy at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He writes extensively on problems of governance and public policy. His most recent book, Superstates, Empires of the 21st Century, was published by Polity Books in 23. I think it represents some really excellent thinking about macro-level assessments of the nation state in light of governance, democratic governance. And I should note that 9 of his earlier books have received 5 book awards. Overall, his scholarship is focused on a range of topics that matter to our field, and more importantly, the times. He's written on topics ranging from the failure of Occupy Wall Street movement to matters of information dissemination and transparency to the historical relationship of American public administration to early to mid-century dictatorships. Across the scope of his work, Al has not shied away from asking big questions and anchoring those questions in deep historical context. His next book, The Adaptive Country, How Canada Can Survive the 21st Century, will be published by McGill Queen's University Press in this year. Al is the first non-U.S. citizen to be elected as a fellow to the United States National Academy of Public Administration. He's received the ASPA Riggs Award for Lifetime Achievement in International and Comparative Public Administration, and Canada's Grace Peppian Access to Information Award for his research on the right to information. He served as an editor of the journal Governance, former director of the School of Public Policy at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. He served on the ASPA Presidential Committee on International Scholarly Engagement. He's also been a tenured faculty member at Queen's University, my alma mater, Syracuse, Maxwell School, Suffolk University, and as well as here regionally at the University of Missouri. And he's got his MPP and a PhD in public policy from Harvard and a JD from the University of Toronto. Please join me in welcoming Al to the podium and give us for the lecture.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to talk with you today. I was saying earlier on that I woke up this morning and went down into the hotel lobby to get a cup of coffee, and I got down there and I realized I had my Mizzou sweatshirt on, and I thought, okay, I'm not dressed for the occasion, but it's a pleasure to be back here in the region, and a pleasure to be back specifically at University of Kansas. So the question I'm going to pose today is the challenge to democracy: is the field of American public administration ready? And the short answer, and I will elaborate, is no, I don't think it is ready. In my view, the field of American public administration is missing a critical opportunity to express its solidarity with scholars and practitioners around the world who are interested in standing up for democratic principles. And I'll elaborate. But what I want to do to start off with is just present you with three propositions. And these are going to be core to my presentation. And what I would invite you to do is take a moment to think about whether you personally accept these three propositions, because it's really going to be central to what I'm arguing about. The first proposition is that there are such things as universal human rights. Rights that every one of us have simply by virtue of being human beings. Rights that belong to people here in Kansas and belong equally to people in China. So that's the first proposition. The second proposition is that democracy and academic freedom are among those fundamental human rights. And when I say democracy, I'm using that as a shorthand to say the right to live under a democratic system of government. That notion that we are entitled to live under a democratic system of government is expressed in Article 21 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says that there ought to be free and fair elections based on universal adult suffrage. But it's expressed in many other covenants and declarations since in roughly similar language, and it's buttressed by other provisions about freedom of speech and freedom of association. So the second proposition that I'm going to ask you to consider, and specifically to consider whether you accept, is that democracy is a fundamental human right. I'd make the same argument that academic freedom is a human right, and I won't spell out the argument, but that's also going to be something I'm addressing later on. And the third proposition is that all of us as scholars and practitioners in the field of public administration should be careful to express and act on our commitment to fundamental human rights. And I'm saying all this because I'm not entirely sure that there is consensus in the field on these three propositions, and that's why I'm asking you to take a moment and think about it yourself. Let me talk for a moment about democracy specifically. Democracy is a new system of government in the scheme of things and a fragile enterprise. If I were to take universal adult suffrage, the principle that all adults have the right to vote, if I were to take that as a prerequisite for democratic governance, then democracy is unambiguously a relatively new thing. In my home country of Canada, universal adult suffrage wasn't established until 1960, when Indigenous peoples finally won the right to vote. Similarly, universal adult suffrage really wasn't established in the United States until the late 1960s, after the struggle over voting rights in that decade. In Europe, universal adult suffrage really wasn't established until the 1970s, when the major European powers finally began completing the process of decolonization. So the idea of democracy in that sense is relatively new. And the other point I would make, and I won't belabor this because I think we will all readily agree, is that democracy is a relatively fragile system. The experts who measure these things tell us we've been in a democratic recession since about 2005 or maybe 2010. We have leaders like Viktor Orban in Europe actively promoting notions of what he calls illiberal democracy. We've got the consolidation of authoritarian rule in China, and I'll elaborate a bit more on that in a moment. And of course, we have the weakening of democratic culture and democratic institutions here in the United States. So lots of evidence that democracy is a fragile accomplishment. Just to elaborate on that point, I'll show you this more or less illegible chart. And what I've done here is I've listed the 20 most populous countries in the world, the 20 countries that have the most people in them. There are about 194 states in the world. Just these 20 account for about 2/3 of the world's population. And I've put a listing according to the Economist Intelligence Unit Democracy Index of how these countries stand, and also the Fragile States Index. The key point, most of the countries on this list are governed by authoritarian or hybrid regimes, and most of them are counted as highly fragile. So for most people living on this planet, state fragility is the norm, and democracy is an aspiration. I should note, just as a passing note, there are two countries on this list that just had elections over the last week, Indonesia and Pakistan. In those two countries, I believe there were about twice as many people registered to vote as were registered in the United States for the last presidential election. So we should be paying more attention to the experience of other countries that are struggling to establish democratic rule. And on that point, I'll just make another point for the public administration scholars in the room. If you were to go to the pages of Public Administration Review, which describes itself as the leading global journal in our field, and to look at which countries contribute to the pages of that journal, you would find that there are 3 countries on this list: the United States first, China next, and Germany a distant third. Those 3 countries alone account for 65% of articles published in PAR, Public Administration Review, over the last 6 years. Every other country on this list combined contributed less than 3% of articles to the pages of Public Administration Review. So in our field, in our so-called leading journals, we have an immense blind spot to the realities of life for most people on this planet. But that's a digression. Where we are in terms of our thinking about democracy is quite different than where we were 25 years ago, which, and I know I'm showing my age when I say this, seems like only yesterday. In 2000, in the late 1990s, we were in a moment of what I will call democratic hubris. This conviction that we'd reached the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama said, that democracy and market capitalism had triumphed. Democracy was the only viable form of government. This conviction that even China was going to democratize. Predictions from some experts in the late 1990s that China would be a democracy by 2020, or well on the way to a democratic rule. So a different mindset entirely about the prospects of democracy. Excessive confidence, if you ask me. So we've seen this kind of fall from hubris. The other thing that we have seen over the last 20 years, and specifically over the last decade really, is the consolidation in China of a strong alternative to the democratic system of governance. The emergence of a technology-enabled Leninist party state. And you might think, well, Al's using inflammatory language here, but I want to emphasize I'm merely using the language that China scholars, the people who study China for a living, would use. This is a system of government in which the Communist Party asserts complete control over all sectors of life. As President Chairman Xi Jinping said in 2017, the party leads everything. It leads the state apparatus, the military, what we would call civil society, and the education sector. The party leads everything. This is a regime that is explicit in its repudiation of what it calls false ideological trends, like Western constitutional democracy, the notion of universal values, the notion that you can have an independent civil society, the notion that you can have a free and open media. And increasingly confident about its capabilities. An argument that the Chinese model presents a compelling alternative to Western systems that have been seen to be stumbling over the last decade. So that's where we are. We're a collapse of democratic hubris and the emergence of a very strong authoritarian model in China. I mentioned that the party aspires to lead everything. Because we are in a university, I will also flag specifically that the party aspires in China to control the activities of universities. The evidence about restrictions on academic freedom in China is overwhelming, coming from credible sources like the Human Rights Watch assessment, the assessment of scholars at risk, the assessment of the Association of Asian Studies, the annual report, Human Rights Report of the Department of State, the Academic Freedom Index, multiple sources making clear that there are heavy and increasingly heavy restrictions on academic freedom in China. According to the Academic Freedom Index, China is one of the most restrictive countries on the planet in terms of academic freedom. So it is distinguished by the intensity of its effort to restrict academic freedom. And there's another sense in which it is distinguished. Putting aside the United States, China has more NASPA accredited programs than any other country on the planet. NASPA is the accrediting program based in the United States for accrediting programs in public administration and affairs, and I will return to that point later on. I've got a book coming out. You never get a talk from me in which I do not shill an upcoming book. So it's called The Adaptable Country. I won't bore you with the details of the argument, but what I do say is that scholars in public administration, as scholars in public administration, we have this special obligation. I believe that our obligation is to demonstrate that we can get through the next few decades, which will be turbulent decades, without sacrificing our commitment to human rights and democracy and diversity. That we can develop systems that are built on the principles of democracy and human rights, which are also resilient and capable of surfing through turbulent waters. And I believe that's what we need to do. We need to show that surviving and thriving in the coming decades, which will be difficult, does not require a slide toward strongman rule or authoritarianism. That's my conception of what our mission should be. One question is whether American public administration is ready to think about the challenges that we're likely to confront. if we want to grapple with the challenge I just described. There are four distinctive features of American public administration as a field of scholarship that compromise its ability, in my view, to think about this kind of big question of building democratic systems that are resilient. I'm not going to go through all of them today, but I'll just briefly touch on them. For the last few decades, the field has shifted away from thinking about big questions about regime design and focused more on middle-level questions of management and policy design for a bundle of reasons. That's one difficulty. A chronic difficulty that's been noted by other scholars is a limited historical awareness in the field. We don't look back very far. And also a limited comparative perspective, not looking to the experience of other countries very much. I elaborate on all of these difficulties in a book I published a few years ago called Strategies for Governing. What I want to do today is focus on the fourth difficulty, and that is the reluctance in the field or ambivalence in the field about grappling with what are sometimes referred to as political questions. So let me talk for a moment a bit about that. This ambivalence about talking about politics goes back a long way. The field of public administration in the US really got going in the late 1920s or 1930s. I'm showing my age again, but I wrote an article that was published in Public Administration Review 30 years ago in 1994 in which I talked about the emergence of the field and the way in which leaders of the field talked about their work at that time. People like Louis Brownlow, who was the sort of powerhouse of public administration in the US at that time, Luther Gulick, who was a well-known scholar, Leonard White, Charles Merriam would be the fourth. They were sort of among the heavy hitters of that period. And they shared common ground in arguing that the field that they were launching was concerned with administration, not policy or politics. And you can see some representative quotes here in which they try to draw that line. Brownlow arguing that public administrators aren't interested in policy or politics. Gulick arguing you can talk about public administration as a technical question without reference to constitutional or political theory. That notion that you can draw a bright line between political theory, politics, and administration. And you might ask, well, how seriously did they take that division at the time? And the answer is they took it very seriously. Right from the get-go, when these individuals were starting the field in the late 1920s, they were interested in international engagement, which at that time meant engagement with Europe. And they started engaging with scholars and practitioners across Europe in the early 1930s. This was a time at which fascism was on the rise in several countries in Europe, notably in Germany. Hitler gained power in 1933. And it wasn't long before news about what was happening in Germany was being reported in American newspapers. As early as 1934, there were stories about the persecution of Jews in Germany. There were stories about the establishment of concentration camps in Germany. There were stories about the Nazi Party's determination to destroy democratic institutions in Germany, the attempt of the Nazi Party to assert control over civil society, and also over universities. All of this was in the public domain. It was reported in the New York Times and elsewhere in the US. Louis Brownlow himself had refugees from Germany in his office pleading for jobs, pleading for some way to support their family. So the leaders of US public administration knew what was going on in Germany. And the question is, what were they going to do about it? It came to a point because they had decided to organize a conference in collaboration with German leaders, German scholars and academic practitioners. They decided to organize a conference in Berlin in June 1936. And as the date came closer, the question was, would the American delegation go to Berlin? As it happens, Hitler announced the reoccupation of the Rhineland just a few weeks before the conference. There were lots of people arguing that the Americans should not go. There were faculty at American universities, students at American universities arguing they shouldn't go. Mayor LaGuardia of New York City said publicly they shouldn't go. There were scholars and practitioners in Britain and the Netherlands and Belgium saying they shouldn't go, but they went. And what was the argument for going? We're just going to go talk about questions of administration. We're not going to get into questions of political theory or politics. That's not what we do. So off to Germany they went in June of 1936. That top picture is actually a picture of the conference hall itself. These are the doors that the American delegation walked through in June 1936. They walked past the Nazi banners into the conference hall. The bottom picture is a picture of the interior of the conference hall, so you can see what it looked like. This is not actually a picture of the conference itself. This is actually a picture of Hitler announcing the reoccupation of the Rhineland a few weeks earlier in the same place. But the hall didn't change its interior design. And when Louis Brownlow addressed the conference in June 1936, he did it from the same podium that Hitler had used. Hitler's office lent Brownlow one of Hitler's cars and a driver. The American delegation met with the Fuhrer, and that was the meeting. In 1958, Brownlow said in his autobiography that he had seen all-pervasive Nazi domination at the conference. But with respect, it was pretty easy in 1958 to be openly opposed to the Nazis. What's interesting is what he told his American colleagues and his funding agencies and the State Department in 1936 after the conference. And what he said was right here, that the conference had demonstrated again that administrators could get together and talk about questions of administration without regard to grand questions of politics. So that was the hardline view that you can separate one thing and the other. One interesting question is whether the American field of public administration changed its view after World War II. And there is some evidence that it did. So there was another fellow, John Gauss, who was very big in the American PA field at that time. He wrote a book in 1945, and he essentially repudiates the Brownlow-Gulick view of the field. And he says you can't detach administration and politics, grand politics. It's all one thing. Public administration is an integral part of the whole system of democratic government. You can't disentangle it. And he also uses what is at that time the new language of human rights, and he says, look, what we're doing is basically also tied up with the business of promoting human rights. It's a different way of thinking about the nature of the field. I began engaging with American public administration in the 1980s, and I would have said at that time that this was the dominant conception of what public administration was about at that time in the 80s or 90s, sort of repudiation of the Brownlow-Gulick view. As it happens, I was on the editorial board of Public Administration Review in 2000, and at that time, Larry Terry, who was then the editor of the board, editor of the journal, published an editorial in which he said exactly the sort of Gauss view. The goodness of administration is inextricably linked to the preservation of a political regime, and by that he meant a democratic political regime. It's all one thing. That was his view. And then he also went on to say this journal he congratulated the journal over the span of 60 years for promoting democracy, and I think this is interesting, promoting democracy not just in the United States but abroad. Made the point that was sort of the historic mission of the journal. A question that I want to get at, and we might say, well, the year 2000, everybody thought democracy was on a roll in the year 2000. It's easy to be forthright about your enthusiasm for democracy in the year 2000. The question would be, are you equally as enthusiastic about democracy? Are you equally as willing to make a commitment about democracy in more difficult times? That's, I think, the question that we sort of want to grapple with. Let me digress for a moment. 2 years ago, I was asked by Alan Rosenbaum, who was then the president of the American Society for Public Administration, if I would co-chair with Mary Lee Rhodes of Trinity College Dublin a committee to look at international scholarly engagement. And the premise was that many types of organizations, schools like the school here, programs of public administration, academic and professional associations, academic journals, were all engaged globally more than they had been before. The world is a more complicated place than we thought it was 25 years ago. So the question we were asked to consider was, how can scholarly organizations of these various types engage internationally while also respecting core values like academic freedom and human rights? And we published a report which was published a year ago. It was endorsed by the National Council of the American Society for Public Administration and later by a similar body in the United Kingdom. And I'll tell you a bit about what we said. We basically said any organization, whether you're a program or a school, an association or a journal, that's engaged globally should have an open conversation about what your core values are. And you should publish a statement of what your core values are so everyone knows what they're about. And you should also take steps to make sure that you're respecting those core values when you go about making decisions in your organization. And also, you should have some kind of mechanism for receiving comments or concerns from individuals who may not think that your organization is living up to that statement of core values that you published. And we didn't pull these recommendations out of the blue. They reflect what are basically best practice at some scholarly organizations and other organizations in the public and private sector. So that was the sort of formula we came up with. We also made some suggestions about what a list of core values might look like. We took care to make clear this wasn't intended to be a definitive list. We also said this isn't rank ordered. And we also said that one of the challenges here is that these values sometimes collide with one another. There's no neat solution to what you should do when you're engaged globally. But the one thing that is clear is that you're more likely to make the right decision if you're clear about what your values are and you're deliberate in thinking about what you're trying to do. That's the essence of the matter. And we did say that in any list of core values, you would want to emphasize promoting academic freedom and also respect for human rights. And of course, respect for human rights includes respect for democracy. So that was the sort of general formula that we came up with. The committee, representing the committee, I approached Public Administration Review, which again represents itself as the leading global journal in the field, twice over the last year to engage with them about the work of the committee. About a year ago, I asked the editors of the journal whether they would be interested in a commentary from the committee about the work we were doing, and we were declined. And then in December, I again asked the editorial team, since the report was released, I asked the editorial team whether they would be interested in setting up a committee of board members to look at the report and consider a response. Even as a Canadian, I would have to say that's a fairly anodyne request. It's not exactly Saul Alinsky stuff. But that suggestion was also declined. And what I was told at that time was we think it best to leave policy statements up to the ASPA leadership and board. I'm not quite sure, frankly, what to make of that response. If I were to take it straight, I would say it has a bit of redolence of Louis Brownlow around it. We don't do policy. But I can't take it straight because, of course, Public Administration Review publishes policy statements. I showed you one earlier in this presentation. I showed you a policy statement from Editor-in-Chief Larry Terry 25 years ago expressing the journal's commitment to democracy at home and abroad. The journal hasn't published a similar commitment to democracy in the quarter century since. However, it has published several editorial statements since 2020, the moment of the Black Lives Matter movement, expressing its commitment to diversity and inclusiveness, social equity, and social justice. And I want to emphasize these are all important values. But the point I think I would make is this. The question isn't, does public administration issue policy statements? Very clearly it does. The question is, when does Public Administration Review issue policy statements? Is it prepared to make sort of general commitments to democracy and human rights, or are its statements going to be driven by the exigencies of domestic politics in the United States? And are they going to attend only to the defense of the rights of Americans, American individuals? So that's one question. I'm going to show you something else, and you may say, well, now, Al, this actually is exactly the sort of thing that you want done, so what's your beef with this? This is a statement of values that was issued by an organization called the Dean's Summit last March. The Dean's Summit is a collection of deans and directors of the major U.S. public affairs school. Last March, they issued a statement of values, and you can see here that they say, we will advance public policies that prioritize democracy and protect the core values on which a stable democracy is based, including respect for the rule of law. And the question might be, well, that sounds entirely noble. What's wrong with that? It is good so far as it goes. The difficulty here is what is not said. And in order to understand what has not been said, you need to know a bit more about what the Dean's Summit is. So the Dean's Summit includes the leaders of the 66 largest NASPA programs in the United States. And for those of you not familiar with the inside baseball, NASPA is a professional association that includes about 300 public affairs programs, most of them in the US, about 90% in the US, about 10% abroad. The Dean's Summit includes the 66 largest US public affairs programs. Those 66 large programs, by my reckoning, accounted for almost half of graduate public affairs degrees awarded by NASPA schools as a whole in the United States in recent years. The Dean's Summit was established recently, and the argument is that it was intended as a collective effort to promote collective action and to promote a sense of collective identity. The point I would make is that when NASPA itself was established 50 years ago, the motivating language was exactly the same. Last year, the executive committee for the Dean's Summit included the then president of NASPA and the then immediate past president of NASPA. And in fact, the last meeting of the Dean's Summit in the fall of 2023 was coincident with the annual meeting of NASPA. So it is very hard to see what the distinction is between a gathering of deans under the rubric of the Dean's Summit and a gathering of deans and directors in the same time and place under the rubric of NASPA, but there is an important distinction. The important distinction is that NASPA, the body which includes international programs, did not endorse the statement of values that was put out by US schools operating under the heading of the Dean's Summit. And this is the question of what is not said. American schools operating under the heading of the Dean's Summit issue a statement of core values that explicitly promises to promote democracy and the rule of law. NASPA, which again is largely guided by many of the same group of schools, has its own statement of public service values, which makes no reference to democracy and the rule of law and academic freedom. It has accreditation standards that make no reference to democracy, human rights, the rule of law, and academic freedom. So we've got two statements of core values operating here. One statement of core values for domestic consumption, one statement of core values that's the export version. And I could also ask, if you've got two statements of core values operating, one operating in one time and place and one operating in another time and place, what exactly does it mean to say that they are core values? It seems to me that we've got two standards running, and this is a matter of concern for me. And the more rigorous standard, the standard that emphasizes democracy and the rule of law, is for domestic consumption only. And my suspicion about this sort of double standard is aggravated by the advocacy practice of NASPA, which represents itself as a global organization which has repeatedly in recent years issued statements of concern about domestic political affairs in the United States. It's issued statements about the politicization of the federal civil service. It's issued statements about Black Lives Matter, critical race theory, sundry other matters, the January 6th assault on the Capitol. It's repeatedly invoked its status as a global organization in defense of American democracy, but it has never issued a statement in the defense of the fundamental rights of anybody else in any other country with a NASPA member school or an accredited program. And bear in mind, again, that the country that has the second largest number of NASPA accredited programs is China. So silence on China, disregard for academic freedom on China, while we're talking about democracy and the rule of law in the United States. NASPA established a global review, established a committee to undertake a review of its global position in 2023. That report came out in October. The committee said it supports democratic values, but at the same time it also said it supports NASPA's current approach to accreditation, which again omits reference to human rights and academic freedom. And the rationale was that NASPA should recognize a separation between quality public affairs programs and the political systems they operate under. And that seems to me to have a whiff of Luther Gulick around it. We can separate the business of training people for public administration from the question of regime design. So I'll wrap up. I emphasize PAR, Public Administration Review, and NASPA because they are two of the most important apex institutions in the field of US public administration. They both represent themselves as global leaders. They have both failed to acknowledge the importance of human rights and academic freedom as core values. And American public administration in this current tendency is distinguished by its silence. UNESCO, almost 30 years ago, issued a statement that universities ought to be accountable for academic freedom and fundamental rights. Another UN agency operating in conjunction with the International Association of Schools and Institutes of Administration issued accreditation standards in 2008 saying that academic programs should be absolutely committed to democracy and human rights. And the Association of Professional Schools of International Affairs, which is a US-based organization that is essentially a sister organization to NASPA, has also issued a statement of commitment to human rights. So at the moment, American public administration, at least these two institutions, are outliers. I think there is a lost opportunity here to express solidarity with people in many other countries who are also struggling to promote democracy, academic freedom, and human rights. And at this critical moment in history, solidarity is key. If apex institutions continue arguing in defense only of democracy and fundamental rights for Americans while remaining silent about conditions elsewhere, they will be vulnerable to charges of self-absorption and, at worst, hypocrisy, a double standard. And we don't want that to happen. So I'm going to end with one more story, and then I'll stop. This is a letter that was written by a fellow named Rowland Egger to Louis Brownlow in June 1935. Rowland Egger was a professor of public administration at the University of Virginia. Later, he was an editor of Public Administration Review. And in 1935, he was the kind of European agent for the Americans who were interested in engagement in Europe. He was in Europe while Louis Brownlow and Luther Gulick and Charles Merriam and Leonard White were in Washington. And he's reporting on a meeting he's just had with a British scholar and practitioner named George Harris. George Harris has just published an article in a new journal that criticizes what the Nazis are doing in local government in Germany. And briefly, what the Nazis are doing is destroying all the mechanisms for local self-control of local government, and they are asserting Nazi Party control over local governments. And this is Egger's response to Harris's article. He calls it, you'll see in the middle, a drooly bit of trash. And you'll see toward the end, he says, all the article shows is that Harris has an unreasoning, sentimental antipathy to Hitler and the idea of dictatorship. And this thing bores me hugely, he says. And then, more to the point, he says, it's certainly not going to make things in Berlin any easier for me. This is a very frank letter. He's writing it to Brownlow, and he's being frank with Brownlow because he knows Brownlow is going to agree with him. So here we are 90 years later looking at this letter. Ask yourself, who in this story was on the right side of history? Was it Harris or was it Egger? And then roll yourself 90 years into the future, looking back at the moment we're in right now. How would we wish to be remembered? Would we wish to be remembered as something like Harris, or would we want to be remembered or as something like Egger? And that, I think, is the choice we have to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Al. We now open it up for questions from the audience. Just recognizing that we have the Q&A online. So if you're online, please put forward your questions online. Otherwise, we'll invite any questions from the field. And I'm going to just start, and then we'll go to Bonnie. Al, you've talked about sort of the normative base of public administration, and one of the challenges that I think we face is, aside from the statement of values you and Mary Lee Rhodes laid out there, can you speak to how well that normative base is articulated, and can you give us some guideposts and some suggestions on how we, as a field, may be able to grow a discourse and strengthen the discourse around that normative framework, whether it has to do with the research questions we ask, the kind of papers we write, historical analyses, the future projections. I know you're also helping us to think about scenarios, about what ifs, about what could be happening governing in the mid-century. Can you speak a little bit more about some suggested avenues for really strengthening that normative base to make this a little more crystal clear for us about what those norms are?
Sure. So very often when we're doing research in public administration, we operate on the basis of assumptions about the way our system of government should work. You know, we undertake studies of citizen engagement or citizen participation, or studies about the relation of street-level bureaucracy and interactions between government officials and citizens and so on. You notice I keep using the word citizen. That's a social construct that has certain implications. we're trying to be rigorous scientists, but we have baked into the way that we think about the world all of these assumptions that are very often unarticulated about the way government is supposed to work. We're looking for certain relationships. Even the relationships we're trying to establish have certain notions about the relationships that ought to exist. I think very often we have baked in to our work certain understandings about the kind of government we would like to have. There are liberal democratic assumptions baked in, but we are not good about making those assumptions explicit. We're not good about having a conversation about what the priors are. What is the world that we're trying to build supposed to look like? That's not strictly amenable to empirical investigation. That's a normative conversation we have to have. So, you know, in the great push to make our field more rigorous over the last few decades, we may have forgotten that we also need to have a conversation, the normative conversation about the values we're trying to promote. That's, I think, one point that I would make. And one result is that when we do have the conversation, it tends to be, I don't want to diminish it, sort of a coffee shop conversation in the sense that it's not a lot more sophisticated than the kind of conversation you would have in a coffee shop. So we need to do that better and more rigorously, especially at this moment in history. Again, you know, in 2000, when it looked like the wind was blowing in the right direction, it may have seemed like we don't need to get into it. Now we do need to get into it. We need to have a serious conversation about the values we're committed to. We need to have a serious conversation about what democratic systems can and can't do. We have to be frank about it. We do have to study authoritarian systems like China. We have to understand how they work. We have to go in and basically see what they can or can't do. Because as I say, this century is going to be a contest between a technologically powered version of authoritarianism and various forms of the democratic model. So we need to know what the comparison looks like. So we need to do all that. The second point I would make is that it's probably true in every country, but it's especially true in the United States, that there tends to be a tendency to have that normative conversation in an American vernacular, by which I mean the words, terms, phrases, concepts that are used are kind of pulled out of American history. And of course, it's understandable that you would do that. But at this point in history, it's also important to build bridges with people in other countries that are fighting the same fight. So it's important to find language that, kind of a lingua franca, that allows people in different countries to have a conversation about what they're trying to accomplish. And in my view, the language of human rights is a powerful device for doing that. There's a doctrine of human rights that has become increasingly sophisticated over the last 80 years. There's an international legal regime and various domestic legal regimes that are built on the concept of human rights. Many democracies have national human rights institutions and so on. So I would also say that, you know, one of the challenges here is to try and do some sort of language training and find a way of building a conversation that crosses borders.
Okay, hello. Oh, okay. Hi, I'm Bonnie Johnson, urban planning professor here at KU and urban planning director. And you talked about earlier today when we met with you about going to Harvard and having case studies. So I have a case study for you. In 2023, the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning are having a conference in Florida. There was a huge rift of we shouldn't go to Florida because of LGBTQ rights. Canada had issued a statement saying it was unsafe to travel to Florida, so our Canadian schools were wondering whether they could come. California was boycotting Florida, so the California schools couldn't come. And so the idea was, well, should we go to Florida or not? After much back and forth, eventually the decision was to not go. The results in some senses were the Florida schools felt abandoned and demonized or pitied, one or the other, and it virtually bankrupted ACSP. So today, it's not Germany, it's our own country. How do we deal with these issues of do we go, not go? How do we show solidarity? What do we do?
Well, that's exactly right. And that's sort of one of the main things. The scenario you just described is one of the main scenarios that sort of drove the establishment of this committee. And we were given the label international scholarly engagement, but it's also about domestic engagement too, right? The same questions arise. And I think I'm not a big boycott fan. I'm not arguing for boycotting engagement with China. What I am for is principled and reasoned engagement in China. The critical thing is to know what you're about. What values are you thinking about, and are you reasoning carefully about how you're protecting these values in any particular circumstance? And there's what you want to avoid is a scenario where a conference gets, for example, established or announced for a particular location, and then at the last minute there's a dust up and a badly reasoned kind of decision about what to do in that particular case. What you want is principled and consistent decision making. We had an instance in the field of public management a few years ago where, was it North Carolina? There was a conference scheduled for North Carolina that was canceled at the last moment because of legislation that had been passed in that situation. And I believe I'm right in saying that the organization that canceled that conference then proceeded to have a conference the following year in Singapore, which has an equally mottled record on questions of civil rights. And so you could ask, well, where's the consistency? So what we basically said is, this isn't a solution for all things, but you're going to be in better shape if you articulate what your principles are well before any controversy arises. If you bake it into decision making so that when you're thinking about where you're going to locate your conference, you're sort of trying to anticipate the controversy and you're reasoning your way through it. And if you also have procedures so that if somebody wants to raise a concern, you're kind of ready to receive the concern. That's what we were getting at in the recommendation. Any organization that's going to be in this line of work should have a procedure that it's established for receiving concerns or complaints, and it should have a procedure for resolving those complaints in ways that appear to be principled, evidence-based, and fair. So that's not going to fix controversies, but at least it will show that you're trying to do what we're supposed to do as scholars. Thank you.
Questions?
Thank you. Hi, Al.
Hi.
Thank you very much. Great presentation, very thoughtful. I'm newly elected to the NASPA Executive Council, and Maya is on the council also. Can you, based on the arguments that you've made today, can you walk us through step by step what changes you would recommend in the NASPA accreditation process that would address your concerns? And I think everybody in this room has been through a NASPA accreditation process. As a former school director, you definitely have. I've been trained, as have many people in this room, to be a COPRA visitor to assess the quality of programs. So given that very heavy and detailed process that's already there, can you help us visualize how that could be modified to take into consideration and address the concerns that you have articulated today?
Yeah. So there's a 4-point plan to a better tomorrow. Yes, I can. I'll just walk through 4 things that NASPA needs to do. The first thing it needs to do is stop calling itself a global organization. It's not a global organization. It's called itself a global standard setter. It's called itself a global organization, a global leader, a global institution, various forms of globality. It's an American-run organization. All of its key decision-making bodies are 90 to 95% composed of American representatives. It doesn't even, by the standards set by the Union of International Associations, it's not even an international organization because it's effectively controlled by one national group. There's no dishonor in that. You know, NASPA used to be an American organization that did great work, and that's fine. You know, it knows what it's about. But if you're going to call yourself a global organization, you take on a different level of accountability. And I'm not sure that NASPA actually wants to do that. I don't think the American schools and NASPA want to give up the degree of control that would be necessary to be an actual global institution, for example. But having called themselves a global organization, you've created a kind of sticky wicket. I'm not American, I'm Canadian. And I find this global organization making representations as voice of a global community of public affairs educators, but only exercising that voice in the defense of rights of American citizens, and never speaking in the defense of rights of anybody else on the planet. That's objectionable. So, one, stop calling yourself a global organization. You're an American organization with international interests. Second, with regard to advocacy, periodically NASPA does put out statements about, you know, the state of the world and what ought to be done. And that's fine, but have a policy that explains when and how you decide when to make a statement. I mean, our specialty is supposed to be producing policies about things. So let's lay out a one-pager that explains these are the circumstances under which NASPA will issue an advocacy statement, and these are the procedures we use to decide what that statement's going to say. Other associations in the United States do this, and it seems to me to be a perfectly reasonable thing to do. And then you will get consistent decision making. It's just like conference locations. So that's the second thing. The third thing is take academic freedom seriously. I don't actually advocate for boycotting China. I don't advocate for boycotting any other country. But I would say that if NASPA is going to accredit programs in China, and there's overwhelming evidence about restrictions on academic freedom in Chinese institutions, I would be very careful about thinking about academic freedom in that context. I would have some way of assessing risks to academic freedom and making sure that the students and faculty and administrators in the school that I am accrediting have the freedom to work that we all take for granted. So there should be an explicit policy on academic freedom. There ought to be explicit standards on freedom, academic freedom. It ought to be an element of the accreditation standards. NASPA ought to have a committee on academic freedom. And I should say that that's not just me saying that. NASPA itself is accredited by a body called the Council on Higher Education Accreditation. It will go up for review by CHIA in a month. CHIA itself has also said that bodies that want to be accredited by CHIA should have a very explicit approach to the handling of academic freedom. So that's thing number 3. Explicit policy and standards on academic freedom and some kind of committee to make sure that that's being taken seriously. And then thing number 4, make a commitment to human rights, universal human rights. Make clear that that's the expression of solidarity. That this isn't just about promoting, defending the rights of Americans. It's about building solidarity with people who are interested in building a better world wherever they may be. So, and I think the language of human rights is the way to do it for the reasons I just described.
Great. We we'll take some more questions from live here, but I want to ask some questions from online. Is there a need for more research into non-democratic public administrations? We have examples among studies of historical administration under kinship, Catholic Church, Marxist histories and analysis, etc. E.g., Eugene Kaminga et al. You want to speak a little bit more about that point?
Yes, there's great work being done on China these days. I mean, amazing work that's being done by many scholars about the evolution of the Chinese regime and the way in which the regime is using technology to for social regulation in a variety of ways, the way in which it's attempting to develop a system that is responsive to a certain degree to the needs of the population while also maintaining party control. You know, you don't have to sign up to what the regime is doing to have an interest in understanding how it works. So absolutely, I would say, I use China as the most prominent example, but absolutely, I mean, we want to be good comparativists. The challenge in our business is, on the one hand, to be clear about the normative project we're trying to pursue, but at the same time to be able to go in without blinkers on and understand how other systems work. So we want to be able to do both.
Let me proffer another one from online. Do you think the current trends in global politics have forced the U.S. and its prominent PA associations and journals to adopt this double standard you speak about, that Russia and China will always oppose whatever agenda U.S. pushes, and therefore U.S. needs to be strategic to do moral policing, or at least address the issues that concern democratic practices in different countries? Or is it the other way, that the U.S. deciding to be selectively moral, e.g. criticizing China and Myanmar for what they are doing to the Uyghurs and the Rohingyas, and choosing not to speak not a word about Palestine, for example, have forced the nation to pay a price in retaining its right to be advocates for democratic participation?
I'm not sure this is entirely going to answer the question, but I think one thing I would say is no one wants to proselytize and evangelize and sort of go abroad and insist that other people do things a certain way, right? I wouldn't suggest that. But I do think it's important to have a clear understanding of what your moral commitments are and what you are trying to accomplish. And you go abroad looking for people who have similar interests, who want to join you in that project. You know, for example, there's lots of people in India, now the world's most populous country, who are trying to figure out how to make that vast country a viable democracy. And you know, we ought to partner with those people who share sort of common objectives and try to figure out, okay, how do we develop administrative schemes, a system of government that spans large territory, large population, that accommodates diversity and respects democratic norms? How do we kind of build alliances and friendships among people with common interests? That's how I would think about global engagement. The other point I would make, and this is sort of a late in the afternoon comment, is that something got in the water at some conference in the United States about 15 years ago. You know, before 2011, Public Administration Review didn't describe itself as a leading global journal, and NASPA didn't describe itself as a global leader and global standard setter. They were American organizations doing fine American work with international interests. And then the kind of language and mission appeared to switch. Now we're global leaders. The difficulty is that I don't think people fully thought through the implications of the new language. They didn't think about the way in which their obligations and accountability were going to change once they set themselves up as global leaders. And in many ways, they continued to operate as American organizations, but talk the language of globality. And a big chunk of what has happened, what has got these organizations in trouble, to the extent they are in trouble, is the contradictions between their kind of path-dependent behavior and the new global rhetoric. And so it's kind of ironic in the NASPA case, because if you ever go through the NASPA accreditation process, the first thing you're told is that there must be alignment between your mission, your governance structure, and your activities. And if you don't have that alignment, you do not get accredited. Well, NASPA's own difficulty is precisely a misalignment between its espoused mission, global, its governance structure, domestic, and its activities. So, I mean, that's the thing that NASPA needs to sort out. On PAR's point, you know, if you're going to call yourself a global organization, don't publish articles that have the headline such and such in the federal public service, because a reader will say, well, which federal public service? You know, there's Nigeria, India, Germany. You know, and if you're going to call yourself a global organization, be prepared for someone to come along and say, if you're a global journal, how is it that the global south is essentially unrepresented in your pages? I talk about the global south more generally, but you know, I could talk about Africa. There are 54 countries on the continent of Africa. Only one of those countries was represented in the pages of Public Administration Review over the last 6 years, and that was South Africa. Every other country on the continent completely neglected. You know, that sort of disqualifies you from being a global journal right there. And you know, if you don't want to take heat for criticisms like that, the solution is simple. Don't call yourself a global enterprise.
Questions? We got another question online. Al, has your thinking changed in any way or been reinforced since writing your book on the large forces that public administration research should engage?
So this is a book I wrote 10 years ago, and it's basically, and it's an argument actually I developed in more detail in a 2019 book called Strategies for Governing, and you can sort of see it in the other stuff I've written more recently. The general point I make is that there needs to be space in the field for a conversation about large questions about the overall structure of government. Back in the 1980s, there was this movement that sort of got launched in our field, you know, the kind of public management movement. We're going to focus on questions of how you manage organizations more effectively. That's kind of reducing your sights from the kind of big picture down to the middle level picture for perfectly understandable reasons at the time. How do we make this organization operate more effectively? But we need to be able to operate at different registers. And at a moment like this, we need to be able to have a conversation about big questions about how government ought to be designed, and specifically how a viable, resilient form of democratic government ought to be designed. If we're not ready to have that conversation, other disciplines will basically do it for us. Political science, or God help us, economics will do it for us. And we don't want that, so we need to upskill. And I'm not saying that everybody in the field needs to do this. The analogy I've made is that there are lots of keys on a piano. To be a good piano player, you need to know how to use all the keys. And right now, we're sort of using the bottom 2/3.
Yeah, Bonnie?
Kind of coming back to the ideas of what democracy is, I'm reminded of E.E. Schachtschneider's Semi-Sovereign People, where he talks about that the basic problem is that in the U.S., people think that it's government of the people, when actually it's a representative democracy. And so people are always disappointed that it's not people on the ground, the average citizen is in control. It's these elected officials that are doing things. And it's that mismatch of ideas of what democracy is that really causes the problem. I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Well, if I were looking at the current predicament, I think in the American context, I would say part of what we're dealing with is the fallout of the neoliberal era, the kind of aftershocks, the realization of the unexpected, unintended consequences of the neoliberal era, rising inequality, rising economic precarity, and the frustration people feel about that. And the country as a whole is trying to figure out how to respond to that reality. That's one dimension of the current crisis. There are other questions of social justice that are on the table that need to be resolved. And I think also another aspect is the question of the division of responsibilities between state and central government, federal government in the US. It's something that needs to get sorted out as well. I wrote this book called 4 Crises of American Democracy that was published in 2016, just before Trump got elected. So really should have been 5 Crises of American Democracy. But the general theme of the book was, I'm not sure I still subscribe to this, but that if you take the kind of long view, there are these periods in which there's sort of a general consensus in the country about what government is supposed to do and who's supposed to do it. There's kind of a prevailing paradigm. And the paradigm, after a while, falls out of sync with realities. And then you get this sort of phase of paradigmatic collapse and confusion and contestation. And then eventually sort of new policy entrepreneurs come in and a new paradigm kind of gets established, institutions shift, and on it goes. I described 4 periods in that book. And basically what I argued in that book was that where we are right now is a sort of the phase of paradigmatic collapse. That confidence of the early 2000s, the kind of neoliberal globalization consensus has completely shattered. And we're still struggling to find, you're still in this phase where you've got entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurs, incidentally, aren't always necessarily heroes. Trump is an entrepreneur, kind of trying to pitch a new model. The point I made in the book is that process of paradigmatic collapse, contestation, and reconstruction is not short. If you look back, it takes like 20 years for it to happen. So I said when I published the book, there's no reason to be surprised that we're in this period of prolonged angst. Historically speaking, it wouldn't be surprised. It's not a shock. My hunch is that, I'm not sure I sign up to the theory I pitched in that book, but I think one of the things that's going to end up coming out of this is a recalibration of understandings about what federal government should do, and a sort of shift, perhaps of unwillingly, of responsibilities back to state governments.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for this talk. I'm Dorothy Daly, have a joint appointment in SPA and environmental studies. So I'm sitting here thinking, you, on the one hand, you have a compelling message that I think will frighten a lot of people who are concerned about a woke agenda. Like in terms of just, you want to expand government and you want non-elected people working for the rights of democracy. And I'm wondering if you can kind of sketch out, like if you were to fill out this argument, what's your alternative to, the Project 2025, right? Like you are presenting something that's so antithetical to what's being pitched right now. So that was one sort of thought. And then another just question I have is, if in 10 to 15 years, if in fact these propositions were really embraced broadly, what would public administration curriculum look like? How different would it be? So you've kind of already talked about research, but thinking through research, teaching, and service, like what kinds of things should we be injecting now to create long-term change? Like I've been jotting down courses. I'm like, oh, these are the things we should maybe start to think about teaching. So
I want to clarify, I'm not necessarily an advocate of big government. And, I'm not sure what a woke agenda would be, but I'm not necessarily an advocate of activist or big government. But I would say we want to be clear about what we're trying to accomplish. And, we might end up having a conversation about what it's feasible to accomplish. Some people might say, I don't think government can do that, or I have different views about how government should do a certain thing. But, we want to have a conversation about what our goals are. And, but I think at the very start, you want to say, well, are we committed to, these are the three propositions. I guess I'll just circle back to them. Are these contentious propositions in the field of American public administration? That, there are such things as universal human rights, that all people are created equal. Do we take these truths to be self-evident? That's the sort of, that's the sort of the baseline, I think, for the conversation. Were I a director of a school of public administration in my leisure time, I think I would probably say there needs to be some space in the curriculum for the normative conversation, right? Here's what we think we're trying to do. We're not being didactic about it. There are many ways in which you might try to accomplish it. We need to have a frank conversation about what government can or can't do. We need to have an honest conversation about what the authoritarian alternative looks like and what it claims as its accomplishments. So we need to have space for that normative conversation. We also need to have space for a big conversation about regime design and what do we think a good constitutional order looks like. We're not all going to agree on it, but we should instill in our students the capacity to have that conversation. It's not going to be the only thing they do, but again, they need to be able to play all the keys on the piano. They need to know how to do the street level stuff. They need to know how to, at least in a general level, know how to manage an organization, and they also need to be able to have a decent conversation about the big questions of what it is we're trying to accomplish.
That's great. With that, we're going to thank Al for his talk. Al, thank you so much. And the goal of this forum is to raise the big questions, not to resolve them. So the dynamic tensions that are inherent to a democracy show that we're on the right track. So please take note of that. And if there are some things that provoked you, look deep and ask why, and respond accordingly, and let's continue the dialogue. Al, we want to thank you. A little gift.
Thank you.
Of some KU swag.
Excellent.
So that next time when you go for coffee tomorrow
That's right.
morning, you don't
I'll
have to
bring
wear
my
your
bag of
Rizzu
stuff.
t-shirt. You can wear a KU School of Public Affairs and Administration t-shirt. And again, we thank you. We thank you, all you online, for sticking with us. We will get this edited and posted online for sharing widely. And again, thank you, Al, for your time and attention. Okay.
Thank you.